Words are the tools of our trade. And the words we choose have specific meaning. And they don't just have specific meaning in the dictionary, they have significant psychological meaning. Let me give you a few examples. They did a study not too long ago where they showed some people an accident, cars coming together. In one group, they said it was an accident. In another group, they said it was a crash. In another group, they said it was a collision. Then they waited a period of time and they went back and asked people to describe what they'd seen. People that had seen a crash reported glass. But there was no glass being broken. But they reported it and they were certain they'd seen it. The word crash impacted them. The word accident has a different connotation. And the word collision has an entirely different connotation. All three have the same meaning. By the way, while I was studying this, I came across an article in a presentation by a prosecutor who actually said, the next time you're in a case and a defense attorney does this, count how many times they say the word accident and then tell the jury at the end, he used the word accident when we all know, doggone it, it was a crash. That was something that was being trained to prosecutors not too long ago. They're studying word selection. And so should we. We should carefully choose words for our case. And let me give you some examples. Here's one. They did a study on the words cause and produce. Cause, in 78% of the situations, creates a negative connotation. So if you say, did you cause that to happen? Or did you cause this to happen? When you're presenting to a jury, their minds are focused and trained to believe that what comes next is negative. What happened? I got cancer. Oh, what caused that? What caused the crash? What caused this? What caused that? Cause is a word that is usually followed by negativity. Produced is a different word. It means the same thing. It has the same potential definition, but produce had a much different result. It resulted in a positive reaction. It was viewed positively. So you might say to yourselves, what's the difference? Well, you might be having an officer on the stand and your words might be, you caused that police report to be created. Now, it's not big. It's not that the jury is going to all of a sudden, negative. But the word cause invisibly creates a negative sense of what's about to follow. And that's what the science says. We should start using the words caused and produced as we see fit. Well, what happened? Well, it produced this. He produced a gun. That doesn't sound nearly as bad, does it? Well, he produced a gun. If I asked you right now to say he produced a gun, well, the word gun is negative, but the word produced is positive. Do you see the difference? So what happened? He produced a gun. Did something bad happen or something good happen by producing the gun? If he caused the gun to come forth, it has a different vibe. All right, here's another one. Facts versus interpretation. Often, we have allowed ourselves to let the word fact be substituted for interpretation or opinions. We need to stop that. We need to let juries know the difference between facts and interpretations. Because you know what interpretations really are? Reasonable doubt. Reasons to doubt. That's what an interpretation is. Facts, well, facts really do push us beyond reasonable doubts. But interpretations, we know what that is. That's as many, everybody has an opinion. We know what that follows. What follows after that, everyone has one, right? Interpretations, that's what that is. Let's start using those words correctly. Sir, is this a fact or is this an interpretation? Now, we're not going to ask him that way, but we're going to start using the word. So you interpreted this as such and such. You interpreted this as such and such. You interpreted this as such and such, right? Instead of just letting it hang there as a fact.
Now remember, everybody has a framework for making decisions. I mean, lawyers, doctors, plumbers, teachers, they all have a framework for making decisions. Not everybody agrees on what reasonable doubt is. In fact, most people aren't really sure when they show up for jury duty what reasonable doubt is, but everybody has a framework. And this is where I think story takes place. Or this is where I think story has a place in reasonable doubt and defining and explaining reasonable doubt. When to argue reasonable doubt, I think you argue reasonable doubt or begin defining reasonable doubt in voir dire. Early on in the case, I know most of you probably have used voir dire charts where you have a chart with reasonable doubt with all the standards laid out. How many people have used those charts? Okay, all right. There's a place for those charts, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. But I think voir dire is a place where you start defining reasonable doubt. And then, of course, an opening argument and closing argument, if you get an opportunity. It's trickier in opening because you may draw some objections, but there are times when you can use a definition of reasonable doubt in opening statement. And certainly in closing argument, you do it. Now, how to do it? I think using analogies and stories is a great way to illustrate reasonable doubt. Is a great way to define and argue reasonable doubt. And I want to give you a couple of examples of that. And I want to also tell you how I develop examples of arguing reasonable doubt. And in Rooting for the Mouse, which is another story that's not related to any video, but Rooting for the Mouse. If any of you have heard this story, it's one that I love. And generally the argument goes like this. We all would agree that the state can prove his case beyond a reasonable doubt using circumstantial evidence. Everybody would agree. For example, take if you had a mouse and you put him inside of a box, right? And then you took a cat and you put him inside that same box and you put a lid on top of the box and you sealed it up with some tape. And you waited 10 to 15 minutes and you went back to that box. You took the lid off. You knew the tape wasn't disturbed. You lift the lid and you look inside and all you see is a cat. And he's a happy cat. All you see is a cat inside the box. So circumstantially, we didn't see the cat eat the mouse, and we didn't see what happened with the mouse, but we can assume, and pretty certain, we can assume that the cat ate the mouse, right? But consider that same box, and you put that mouse inside that box, and then you took a cat, and you put a cat inside that box, and you sealed the box up again, and then you left for another 10 minutes or so, and you came back to that box and opened up the lid and all you saw was a cat. But when you look closely at the box, over in the corner, maybe the size of a quarter, you see a small hole large enough for a mouse to fit through. Are you sure that the cat ate the mouse? Or do you have some reasonable doubt that that mouse went out of that hole? That hole, ladies and gentlemen, is a reasonable doubt. And here in the state's case, there are a lot of holes, a lot of holes. So another illustration that kind of illustrates, reasonable doubt, a way to argue and define reasonable doubt for a jury.
Our brains are capable of processing every single blade of grass when we look at a lawn. But if our brains did that every day, they'd explode. It would be too much information. So our brain makes a shortcut and it looks at all those individual blades of grass and processes that as lawn. And when we do this in the context of decision making, it's referred to as heuristics. And what that means is we recognize as human beings patterns, and we recognize things based on the way we grew up and our social perceptions, and we make decisions without thinking at all. And this is not a presentation about bias and implicit bias, but if you go to presentations about implicit bias or look into the psychology of bias, we'll see that these shortcuts are often at the core of at least implicit bias in decision making. And it's just a way for our brains to process lots of information without overloading. I was really happy to hear this morning's presenters talking about credibility, because really the net of the studies on expert testimony is that jurors first make a decision about the credibility, the believability of the expert, and then filter what they're hearing through that. Different from attorneys. That is actually not true of attorneys. And then we have high cognition learners and low cognition learners, so people who need to process things versus people who don't. So when it comes to expert witnesses, high cognition jurors are persuaded more by the substance of their testimony. Low cognition jurors are persuaded more by their credentials. But both, regardless of whether they are high cognition or low cognition jurors, the first thing both of those groups do is assess the credibility. And I don't mean by their credentials. I mean by, are they looking me in the eye? Are they nice? Are they talking to me? Can I follow them? Right? So this tells us that when we're dealing with experts, well, first of all, when we're dealing with experts, you're probably better off going without them. And the reason for that is there are several studies that suggest that when it comes to defense cases, they just believe that these experts are going to say anything that the defense attorneys want, regardless of how much they like them. So you are probably far better off working with your experts to prepare the cross-examination, and then leaving the expert at home for the actual trial. But if you can't do that, you want to make sure that you frame the evidence as a story so that the expert isn't sort of some aside to the story or a pause in the action. The expert becomes part of the action in the story. You want to work with them on style as well as substance and learn that shorter is better. And use visual aids, not PowerPoint. Because if there's a PowerPoint that has a lot of words on it, it's going to take the jurors away from making that connection, that credibility connection with the expert that we know is so important.
So, since I mentioned the Colorado method very briefly was developed by David Wymore in 1995 for the use in death penalty cases. It's a technique that exclusively focuses on capital penalty phase and the decision whether or whether not to kill his client. It's exclusively based on for-cause removal of the legal impairment of whether a juror can give life or save life if the defendant has been convicted of murder, usually a brutal murder, usually a multiple set of brutal murders. And so the Colorado method would develop and focus 100% of its focus on that question. Are you automatically going to kill when you find out my client over here slaughtered 20 people? And those of you who have done death penalty litigation understand that, and it involves a scoring method. And I use a scoring method too. I don't want to go too heavy on what my scoring method is, but think of it as a range, okay? And in death penalty litigation, a wit excusable witness or a juror is someone who is a 1 on David Wymore's scale, and they will never kill. They just say, well, I just think killing's wrong. It doesn't matter. You're excusable because you have a legal impairment. You cannot exercise the law which says you get to kill somebody if the right set of circumstances happen. And a 7 in David Wymore's scale is automatically. I'm going to kill the son of a bitch every time, and I don't need any examples or whatever. If it's available, I'm using it. Okay? And both of those jurors are excusable for legal impairments. It's also developed a series of techniques which David calls stripping. And we'll get into my terms here in a second, but it's designed to strip away a juror's efforts to qualify answers or to condition their answers. The Colorado method applied to sexual assault is something I've developed. It's a technique that focuses on one or more inherent biases attendant to the particular case. It's based on techniques to get potential jurors to adopt legal impairments to support for-cause removal. It's just a systematic process of that. Again, same scoring system. A 1 will never convict on sexual assault. That's a unicorn. I've never met one. Number 7 is probably half the jurors that you find in your panel. So that's the terminology that I used. The techniques were drawn heavily from David Wymore's groundbreaking work in capital offenses. And my system works. You don't know me, you don't know my cases, but I'm telling you, it works. I have used this system to win cases. I have used this system to blow up a jury panel of 85. We had to start over again because it was working too well. I was killing too many people. There were too many bad facts that were attendant to legal impairments. So rather than the single issue of will you kill or will you not kill, which is the traditional Colorado method, the impairments that we typically see in sex assaults, and you know these are your cases, right? The nature of the charge. And we can stop right there because 80% of all the impairments you're going to be able to probably mine, unless you've been doing it like me for many, many years, is going to be just the nature of the charges. I mean, we know that. That's usually where we get 20 to 30% of all of our challenges for cause. They just say, based on family victimization, personal victimization, nature of the charges.
That your trial strategy at the guilt-innocence phase is very much a part of the penalty phase. It is a two-part play. And unless you have something where it's a separate jury for some reason at the penalty phase, the jury that is sitting at the penalty phase is going to carry over all sorts of information and sometimes baggage into the penalty phase. And the reason this is so important is that one of the major findings that we found, and again, it's not necessarily surprising, but it's important to emphasize, that if the defense puts on what we might call a denial defense, my client did not do it, is a deadly defense on par. Because what happens is jurors view that when you then stand up at the penalty phase and say, listen, we know that you convicted our client and, we accept that penalty, you accept that verdict, but let us now tell you, this is what the jurors are hearing, let us now tell you why he did, which we passionately argued to you in our closing argument he did not do. And you have no credibility. And jurors view it as manipulative. They'll use phrases like, yeah, the defense attorneys tried to pull the wool over our eyes, and we all sort of looked at each other knowingly when they acknowledged that their client actually was guilty. And it plays into another thing, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which is they are more likely to see your client as posing a future danger. And I will contrast this with what we might call an admission defense, where jurors are much less likely to carry it over into the penalty phase against your client. And an admission defense would be something along the lines of, yes, my client did it, but he was insane, or it was heat of passion, or it was in self-defense. And even though they might have rejected that and found your client guilty of capital murder, or else we're not talking about a penalty phase, right? It is something which they do not, as long as you have some credible evidence for it, it is not something which they are going to hold against you in the same way. Multiple actors is the same thing, right? Often jurors will vote for life because they'll say, yeah, I knew that he was involved, but I wasn't quite sure he was the ringleader or that he was the trigger person or whatever. So those types of, if you will, admission defenses, where you're not saying to the jury, hey, listen, my client had nothing to do with it, but you're giving some type of, affirmative defense or is something which, if you have evidence and it's credible, so they're not thinking, oh man, this was manipulative, is not held against you. And one reason I emphasize this and want to bring it up is that I know you heard a talk about McCoy yesterday, right? And McCoy is a really interesting case that's going to, no doubt, have a lot of ramifications. And there will be cases where your client may insist, despite tremendously strong evidence of guilt, in terms of seeking an acquittal. But I just want to put it on your radar screen that from what we know, and I was talking to Richard who gave the McCoy talk yesterday, and he's in full agreement with this, your first need, your first obligation as a defense attorney in that type of case is to try to dissuade your client from pursuing the acquittal, right? Ideally, you work out a plea and get a life sentence that way or even a term of years. But it is important to stress that sort of the reasonable doubt strategy, something which we've all done in non-capital cases, right? Well, listen, it's up to the government to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and you sort of make your best argument as to why there's reasonable doubt. In a capital case, that is not a cost-free strategy. In fact, it increases the chances of a death sentence significantly.